it should be the default for how you start. Like starting simple is always good. So I would start any project with that mindset.
This is What the Jam, an interview series where we're finding out what's next for Jamstack. Find out more at thefutureofjamstack.org. Today we have Raymond Camden, who is a big name in the Jamstack community. He wrote the book called the Jamstack book and has written a lot of content, particularly about 11T, the static site generator. So very excited to have Raymond join us today and talk about Jamstack. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Let's start off with the age-old question. What does Jamstack mean to you?
I don't know. There you go. So, for me, Jamstack was a nice marketing label for something that evolved out of just basic static websites. I gave a lot of presentations on static websites when I first got into them because I really liked them a lot. But there was a lot of it's X, Y, and Z. It's static, but you can make it dynamic with these things. And honestly, I appreciated having a marketing term that kind of coined this new way of building sites where it was mostly static. You had less things that you were dependent on, but could still have dynamic aspects of it, either via serverless functions, client-side JavaScript, so forth. So much like how serverless is just a term, but it helps give it a good mental
Yes.
model of what we mean. Jamstack for me does that as well.
Mm. So what was your journey into talking about static and Jamstack and everything like that?
Man, you made a big mistake. So I've been doing this since '93 or so for a very, very long time. When I began working on the web, you pretty much did everything. There wasn't much that you could do back then. So I started off kind of doing everything. I discovered Perl CGIs as a way of adding dynamic aspects to web pages because like that was really the only way,
Mm.
and it really clicked with me. And I moved from Perl CGIs to a product called ColdFusion. It's a server-side language, a bit like PHP, but commercial, not free. But it worked really, really well. And I spent 15 years building websites with ColdFusion and blogging about it and presenting, etc. Um, and so that kind of worked well for me. What happened is that the web got a lot better, thankfully. The platform as a whole just got really good, and I started doing more front end work and appreciating what could be done without needing a backend server.
Mm.
And at some point, um, I had a bunch of Cold Fusion sites that were just kind of humming along, just sitting there, and they were using Cold Fusion, Apache SQL Server or MySQL, and they were database-driven sites that had not had their data changed in probably a year or so. So I randomly came across a product called Harp, which was a static site generator, very, very basic. And I'm happy I ran into that first because being basic, it was kind of simple.
Yeah.
And I looked at it, and what kind of clicked with me is, it's kind of like having an application server on my machine, but when it's done, it's just flat files. And I took one of my simpler Cold Fusion websites, got the data, I made it ready for Harp, and ran a command, and like, bam, I had flat files. I put it on S3, and I went and I killed the web server. I killed the application
Yeah.
server. I killed the database server, and bam, like I kind of fell in love. And like, obviously, I knew like even back then, like you couldn't transfer everything, but there was so much that I had done over the past 15 years where it absolutely would have worked well.
Mm. Yeah. What do you think that shift was? Because at one point, we have a world where, well, everything's static in the beginning.
Yeah.
Then we go dynamic and we push that more and more complex things, and we're getting more non-technical people creating things for the web because of these platforms. But at some point there was a shift back to thinking about more kind of static approaches. Like, why do you think that shift happened, and what was the catalyst?
I think it was web platform. I think it was HTML5, which was kind of a lame marketing term, but I think the HTML5 timeframe is really where people realized there was so much more that you could do in the front end. Now that also led to things like 500K of JavaScript.
Yeah.
Um, but the fact is, the browser started moving to like the evergreen thing of constantly updating, and like all of a sudden like you could do things and rely on things working on the platform and not require a app server on the back end.
Mm, yeah, I mean, in those early days, there was just so much pain in the front end of, okay, I got it working in IE6, but now Firefox, it's just a mess. So now I need to spend hours just trying to corral it into that. Whereas I don't really think about that so much these days. I'm like, well, it works in Firefox, which is usually what I develop on. So it's probably
Yeah.
going to work in Chrome. It's probably going to work in Safari. There might be very minor things, but yeah, I feel like the platform is just. I think all of these companies coming together and standardizing it has been very much needed. Uh, and,
Yeah.
and and to your point, like part of this movement.
Mhm.
Yeah. So you start with ColdFusion, Harp. What happens after Harp? So Harp is I think it might have had some templating, like you could include header
Yeah.
and footer, and it did some asset handling, like maybe compression on the CSS. Um, maybe, yeah, I can't remember
I
now.
don't
It's
think
been a
it
while.
even.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I had done a couple of very small sites converted to Harp, and was happy with it, but I hit the limits of what a Harp could do with more powerful sites. I switched to two things primarily. Uh, One was Jekyll, and Jekyll was really, really nice, very flexible, but incredibly painful to install. I'm a Windows person mostly. Once you get it installed, it's fine. But like I remember I had it on my desktop, I needed it on my laptop, and I was like, oh, it's gonna like this whole day will be doing just Ruby once I get past that.
Totally.
Um, and I also did a lot with Hugo, primarily because I had a blog that I had written in ColdFusion and ran for many, many, many years. It was my blog. It was also very big in the ColdFusion community because it was an open source project as well. And I wanted to move to a new thing. So I first moved to WordPress and found out that yes, the authoring environment is wonderful. It's
Mm,
beautiful. I love to write stuff in WordPress, but like mine crapped the bed within 24 hours of running. And
mm,
then I discovered, oh, like out of the box, you do have to tweak it. I just kind of assumed it would run. So I didn't stay long on WordPress, and I looked at static, and I think I tried Jekyll first, but Jekyll was too slow.
mm.
My blog 5 years ago or so, when I was kind of transitioning off Dynamic, would have had 6,000 blog posts,
Yeah.
and it was like 15 minutes or so to run,
Yeah.
even locally. It was
It's a
just painful.
non-starter.
Yeah, Hugo was like half a second.
Yeah.
It was just shocking. The only thing that got me off Hugo is that Hugo was like strict about how to do things. And like, I remember one time I just wanted to have dynamic files that output to JSON, not HTML,
Mm,
and Hugo would not allow it, or I wasn't smart enough to figure out how to do it. I ended up, yeah, this was for like an Ajax loaded thing, and I ended up just saying, screw it, I'll load HTML. Like
mm,
I won't bother with the JSON version. I'll just plop. Um, and I know that Hugo eventually added that support, and even when they did, I wasn't smart enough to figure it out. Like I just couldn't do it. And Jekyll made that pretty easy.
yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
So what comes after Hugo? So you evaluated Jekyll and Hugo. Where did you end up?
So so, like I said, Hugo, I felt constrained by. Jekyll felt great, but I hated just the fact that it ran on Ruby. Just again, my personal opinion, Ruby wasn't good for me. Um, and then I saw 11D, and so right away I saw Node.js base, so I knew that would work fine and in all my environments. Um, but what sold me is all the languages it supported. So it supported Liquid, which is what Jekyll used. It supported EJS. It supported Haml, Pug. It supported everything out there.
Yeah.
And the more I played with it, I realized there was no walls anywhere. Like you could do anything in 11. It's like just whatever you want to do. Um, I was converting my blog, and it's funny, like for the most part, it's just standard blog posts. I had built my own little stats page, just the things I care about. And initially, it was a lot of JavaScript. When I converted it to 11D, I was all right. I can't do this liquid, but I can use EJS. EJS is not a pretty language at all, but I love that with 11D, I could use my nice language for everything else, switch to EJS just where I needed,
Yeah.
and just carry on. Like the flexibility, and it's still there today. Like I never worry about doing something in 11D. I just period. I know I can do it.
Exactly. Yeah, I found the exact same thing. Like Hugo is amazing, but you have to fit into its content model. And it works great if your use case fits into that. But if you're trying to do outside of it, you're battling against Hugo. Whereas 11T really doesn't dictate how to model your content at all, or what templating language to use within reason. And yeah, just that freedom and that knowing that if 11T can't do something, that there's going to be a pretty elegant way of doing it. Yeah, it is really freeing. It's something I really appreciate too. Yeah. So, yeah. So, yeah, your journey is really interesting. What do you the Jamstack has evolved a lot since it was first coined in 2015. It sounds like you were kind of coming into the static site generators around that time. How have you seen Jamstack evolve during your time with messing with static sites in this world?
Yeah, it feels like I think the biggest change has been the rise of the backend solutions that spit out huge JavaScript bundles that are basically like a way to build a Vue app locally, like Nux. And I haven't looked at Nux in a long time, but like to me, it felt like I'm doing a server-side application that's Jamstack-ish, but my end result is a Vue.js application, and I feel like there's been a lot of that, and that caused, I think, a lot of um, people to get upset because they would look at the performance impacts of pushing all that JavaScript. Uh, that seems to be one of the biggest changes. Whereas stuff like 11e is completely neutral in what it outputs, and you could be as bare metal as you want. I think that was kind of a negative thing, although I think those tools are great if you
Yeah.
know what you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I
agreed.
think
Like,
that's the big thing, right? Like if you know what you're doing.
yeah, and you have a use case that
Yeah.
like is good for that tool. I think it's often seen as a hammer for all problems now, which
Mm.
it leaves out a lot of these very specialized tools that might be better for certain use cases.
Mm.
Yeah. So where do you see the line of Jamstack? It's like the definition has been expanded to basically mean modern web development, which includes SSR, which is basically dynamic websites. It includes serverless. It includes static. Like, where do you think Jamstack should start, and where should it end?
That's, I think from the beginning, when I would talk about this, I would talk about, how you have flat files, but where the dynamic aspects can come in. So like a build time, client side JavaScript, post build time, there's all these opportunities. I always tried to say that if you find yourself trying to do something and just like building a hack of like 1,000 steps or whatever, just to get a bit of dynamicness in,
Yeah,
then that should be your red flag. Like, if you
big
feel like
time.
you're really forcing it, then stop forcing it and go to an app server. So I'm a big believer in like trust your gut. Like when you feel like this is just doing too much, I do think it should be the default for how you start. Like starting simple is always good. So I would start any project with that mindset. Probably a bit biased being in the Jamstack world though.
Yeah. No, I think that's what's missing, especially with a lot of these more modern frameworks that really blur that line between static and dynamic. Is it doesn't become so front of mind, that difference. It's kind of lost
Mm.
now, and because the definition's been stretched so wide, that a lot of those nuances have been lost. When I think those nuances are really important. For example, like a lot of people think, well, will say, why do we need static? Let's just add a CDN in front of a dynamic site and have very aggressive caching. What do you think about that, and why might you want to? Is that static, having like very aggressive caching in front of a static site, a dynamic site?
I would say if the application server is still running, it's dynamic. It's not static. You know,
Yeah. Why?
period.
Why? Why? What's the difference?
Because it's still an app server, PHP, Node, or whatever. You still have that running. It's still a dependency. It's still something that you have to keep in mind.
Yeah.
So like yeah, period. Like if the software is running, then it's not static.
Yeah. And I think it's an interesting point. Like that complexity probably has to live somewhere, but it's a question of whether it is local or whether it's
Yeah.
on a public facing server.
Yeah, so that's I forget the person who said it, but years ago, I was watching a presentation about this was pre-Jamstack, just static websites, and that person said like this is not about removing the complexity, but it's moving it locally. So
Yeah.
I know, especially when I was on Hugo and Jekyll, um, because of the large nature of my site, to get it running efficiently locally, to get it running well in production, I had a lot of complexity. I had a lot of things that I had to set up such that the final result was just files. So it was complex, but it was on my machine. And if that crashed, then I didn't have to worry about anything because my live site was still fine.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a lot of ways that a dynamic site could fail.
Yeah.
And there are ways that a static site can fail, but it's like the difference between a bicycle and a car. Like a bicycle, you could break the chain, the seat could break, yes,
Mm,
but there's just way less things that can go wrong. And if something does go wrong, it's very easy to fix. Whereas a car, you probably need some sort of specialist, to a mechanic,
yeah.
to get there and understand the problem and fix it. And there's just a lot more that could go wrong. Um, yeah, I think that's, yeah, that can be lost. And
I think it's fair to say though, like when I do talk about bringing the dynamic aspects back at build time or client side, like even myself in my own blog posts, I don't spend a lot of time talking about the air handling,
mm,
about like what to do when it fails. I do think in the Jamstack world, we probably need to talk more about that. Like I'm gonna do a daily build of my e-commerce site just to have daily stats for
yeah,
product availability, how long to ship, and I'm fine with it being every 24 hours. I would love to see not only like, oh, how would you do that in 11D with like Fauna as a back end, but also what do you do when the build fails? Like, how do you represent that? Uh, that part I feel like we don't talk about enough, and I put myself in that blame, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think you should do in that situation? So you try and get the stats from your database, and the
Yeah,
database is down. What do you do?
that's a good question. So, couple options that come to mind. So I'm thinking about a simple, like not Amazon.com,
Yeah,
obviously. Like we sell like 5 or 6 products and we want to know basically in stock and how long to ship.
yeah,
You can imagine like an Etsy level person needing something like that. So if I can't get that data from the database, then I could set up 11 such that it still builds the product pages out, but says something. Say, currently we're not aware of our inventory. Please check back again
yeah,
tomorrow. And do we turn off e-commerce completely or still allow that? But maybe our shopping cart also puts that warning out there, like, hey, we're not sure. That's one option. Another option, like, and I know with Netlify, if you fail a build, it won't replace what's there. So maybe you say, you know what, I'm fine going on yesterday's stats. That's another option as well. To doing things like on daily failed build, send a emergency SMS message saying fix it because we can't be without that,
yeah,
and it's ringing you at 12 a.m. to wake up and fix it.
yeah. No, I think those are all the options I could think of. And what's interesting is that it would, if you were going with a dynamic approach, it would probably be very similar solutions. I can't actually think of anything that would be different. But serving the stale content one is just a little bit harder because now I need an extra layer of cache that's like keeping the last successful version. So if I ever need it, I can fall back to that stale version. Whereas with the static approach, you just kind of have that by default, and you'll
Mm,
know if the build fails, and you just okay, don't do anything, just keep it
yeah.
stale. Yeah, no, it's interesting. So your roots are in the ColdFusion world, which, to my understanding, at least in those early days, is a thriving community. What do you think the Jamstack community can learn from ColdFusion community? Yeah, like what made that so good?
People were nice. People are just nice there in general. Maybe the smaller sized help with that. Um, the smaller the pool of people, the less chance you have of jerks being in there. Um, I'm not saying we should keep the community small per se, but I mean, technical communities now compared to like 2005, there's absolutely a lot more just general mindset of being welcoming, being diverse.
Mm,
Um, Codes of conduct, that wasn't really around 15 years ago, or at least I don't remember them being around. So by default, I think most communities nowadays are at least aware of needing to be friendly, needing to be welcoming to people. Now, one thing that the Jamstack community would not have is like one tool set, and the ColdFusion
yeah,
community was pretty much one tool. There's a couple options nowadays. There's an open source version as well, but um, still, it's like two options. Jamstack is, I think last time I checked, it was what 300 static site generators. Probably most of them are not being worked on too much anymore, but yeah, there's a lot more variety out there.
yeah. No, I think that's a good point, and I think it's I don't know the right way to describe this. It's it's deep in terms of the number of static site generators, but it also is also wide in the coverage of technologies because you have static and serverless and now server-side rendering. So it's this huge pool of different approaches, and someone doing a purely static site versus someone doing a full application using kind of Jamstack approaches. There's there's some shared commonality there, but it's fairly abstract. The problems that they'll fairly not abstract, like differentiated. The kind of problems they'll be facing, and the tools they're using will probably be completely different. Like I think you made a good point there, just shrinking it down and being more concrete about this is what it is and this is what it isn't, and this is what it's good for, this is what it's not good for. I think that would create a much stronger community.
I could see that.
Yeah. What do you think? What else do you think needs to happen for Jamstack to be relevant into the future?
I mean, keep on being efficient. I think we saw a natural pullback from things that were producing giant bundles of JS crap on the front end, and there was attention given to the fact that the solutions that don't force you to spit out all the JavaScript can create better performing websites. So I think that shift has already kind of begun, which is good. And
Yeah.
I think keeping that in mind is important. Keeping being flexible, and certainly 11 is not the only flexible option out there. Um, Being concerned about the tooling aspect, I think, is also helpful as well. Being cognizant of the fact that we need to be able to build these tools quickly. Just DevX in general, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
totally. Yeah, no, I agree. I think those are all really important, and just putting a spotlight on these approaches and tools, because I feel like the spotlight's often elsewhere in web tools these days, and there's a lot of great things happening in this space.
Mm.
Yeah, Raymond, thank you so much for joining today. This is a really great conversation.
Not a problem.
That's it for today's interview. Find out more at thefutureofjamstack.org.